Hello, lovely people. It's been a hot minute since we had a Thoughts from the Dog Park vid. So now that the latest in our series of summer heat waves has broken a bit and we can go outside without roasting, very, very nice. RIP to all of the grass in our neighborhood, however. I thought I'd take Tizzy to run around and have a good time and then just download to you guys a bit because it's been a minute. It's been a minute since we did one of these. How you been? As I've alluded to, and if you follow along my unwatchable Instagram stories, you will know this. But basically, I spent the month of July traveling. I was in a dear friend's wedding at the start of the month in Latvia. I did a travel vlog about it. I'll link that somewhere. And then Jeff and I went back to the States, to Salt Lake City, Utah, which is his hometown, to spend some proper time with his family. And honestly, it's been a couple of years since I've been back in the States. It used to be that we traveled to the States pretty regularly. In fact, when we moved to London, we went home probably once a year. And that was for a few reasons. Number one, I am the oldest on my side, and Jeff is the youngest on his. And in his case, um, all but one of his older siblings were married at the time, and all of them had kids. So it is bluntly a lot cheaper for a childless couple to travel to the States than it is for a family of three to seven to travel to see us at any given time. And in the case of my family, when we got married, all of my siblings are a lot younger than me, and they were still in school. We've been married for about 5 years when we first moved to the UK, and bluntly speaking, that kind of status quo that I described stayed the same for a lot of the time that we've lived there. Family is important to both of us, and so we both prioritized traveling to see them when we could. But that sometimes came at the expense of not being able to travel to other places that we wanted to see. I spent a good portion of my childhood in Europe. My family had lived in the UK previously. I am really, really fortunate to have seen a lot of the world, but part of the reason we moved to the UK was so that we could travel in the UK and in Europe and globally more generally. And uh, we didn't always take advantage of that when we first moved here. Not because we didn't want to, but because uh, we're poor. So after a few years of going home to the States, at least once a year, trading off family visits, Jeff and I, made the decision we were going to prioritize couple travel more. We were going to actually see the parts of Europe that we wanted to see, and we made some really good memories being able to do that. We still went home for important things, but we didn't prioritize going back to the States as much. So our travel in that area of the world declined. Then, obviously, the pandemic happened and no one went anywhere for a couple of years. And since then, I've only been back to the States a couple of times. So, as time has gone on, my touch points with the US and the lived culture and lived experience with the US has changed dramatically in the time that we've lived in the UK. And my breaks between visits have gotten longer and longer. This time, it's been over 2 years since I was last in the States. And the last time I traveled there, it was also to Salt Lake City, Utah. That was to attend one of my brother's weddings. And this past trip, Jeff and I actually attended the first ever wedding of our niece and nephew generation, which is really, really exciting for us. That was a big family milestone, and obviously we wanted to be there for it. Um, I think I've alluded to this elsewhere, but my mother in law is also battling cancer. She is a rock star and she is fighting the good fight, but it's important to us that Jeff gets a lot of quality time with her. He actually went back to the States last year after her first major surgery and round of chemotherapy because he and all of his siblings were, doing their shift and providing care to her. So he's been back to the States more regularly than me. In that case, it was really important that we get him there as quickly as possible and for as long as possible. So I didn't travel with him last year, but it was non-negotiable that we were both going this year. For stateside travel, this year was kind of a more gentle experience. Often when we travel to the States, we try to combine some kind of adventure with our family time. So the last time both Jeff and I were in the States, he and his parents and some of his siblings all got together to rent a cabin in the mountains, and we went out to the wilds of the western United States and just did some fun stuff together as a family. This wasn't that. This trip was purely about spending time with people, family and friends, and it was really, really lovely. But as I said, it's been a while since I've been back, and every time I go back to the States with longer and longer breaks in between, I notice more and more ways that I feel more and more alienated from a lot of American culture, which is weird because I joke all the time that I am fundamentally American in a lot of ways. But I haven't been there or traveled there except for short visits for several years now. The last time I was on the East Coast, it was for X's 40th birthday party in New York City, which was an absolute blast. And other than that, all of my recent trips to the States have been to the Western Desert, where my husband is from. And as I said, every time I go back, I notice more and more how that part of the United States doesn't feel like home to me. That's not new information to me. I, 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 for all of the reasons that I kind of listed before, I don't really consider any part of the United States home. Home is not so much a place to me, it's people. For that reason, home to me is the UK because that's where my husband is. That's where I live, and that's where we're building a life together. But when I think of home in the States, it's very much where my siblings are, where Jeff's family is, or where my two best friends live. And yet, every time I go back, with the exception probably of New York, which is the most culturally similar to London of all of the places that we frequent, there's so much about American culture that is so foreign now to my lived experience that I always feel weirdly out of place whenever I go back. And I've been thinking a lot about this for a lot of reasons. If you caught my last chat with Misty, we talked a lot about property, and that's because Misty is having her own adventures in the wild worlds of British rental properties. Jeff and I are hoping to eventually buy a home in the UK. That's been a goal of ours that we've been working towards for a very, very long time. And it's been a major topic of discussion in our household for at least a couple of years now. So for all of these reasons, I was really, really alive to the lived experience that I got whilst on this visit to the States. It's so, so different from my life in London. And I just thought maybe you guys would be interested in hearing just another set of cross-Atlantic observations of what it was like for me to go back and re-experience American suburbia after several years away from it, and frankly, having had only personal, very, very short personal lived experience with it my whole life. If you're new here, I grew up in the military, which meant that, my family and I moved every 2 or 3 years. And depending on where we lived, I lived on base in military housing, which is a very, very specific lived experience, or nearby bases, which meant that our day-to-day lived experience of everything from grocery shopping to local community had its own unique flavor. Or when we lived out in the community, as we did when we lived in Germany or Belgium, we were quite literally strangers in a strange land. So probably not having the typical local suburban experience. Also, American suburban life is very much its own thing. It's a product of a lot of the things that we talk about on this channel. The post-World War II global order that has specifically catered to and built and maintained the American working and middle class. Also, American colonization and imperialism and westward expansion being what it is, so much of American suburbia is new. It's so young compared to whole stretches of the UK. Like, I don't have to tell any British person this, but it still blows a lot of Americans' mind that there are streets of houses that are centuries older than the United States of America that people are still living in and moving through and working on today. America is so, so, so young, and our lived experience and our lived culture as a result is also very young. But even more than that, American suburbia is only about half a century old. It is a new thing, and it's a very, very unique microculture all of its own. And frankly, having not really been raised in it, and having spent the last 15 years making very deliberately different lived experience choices, I'm not surprised that American suburbia feels as foreign to me as it does. It's not the way that I have structured my life, and it's not the way that I want to structure my life in the future. As always, the caveats, let me be clear, nothing I'm about to say is necessarily a criticism of the average American. It's absolutely not a criticism of any of my friends or family. If you come from my in-laws, I will come at your throat. They are the best people I know, and I love them. It's also not even an indictment of, the average American, because as critical as I can be of my own nation, we're talking about people whose lived experiences and whose, day-to-day circumstances have been largely constructed around them. And like everybody else, everybody is quite literally just getting along in the environment that is presented to them as best they can. So even though I'm going to be a little bit critical of a lot of American things here, I don't want that to be taken as me being critical of people necessarily. Um, there's a lot about America that I find to be structured in spite of people and its well-being. And again, if you watch my last chat with Misty, we talked a lot about how America is not necessarily built for community. And that's something that really came alive to me on this last visit. So in no particular order, some of the things I noticed or thought about or were reinforced to me on this trip include, LOL to saying this right now in the middle of a drought and like our 11 billionth heat wave, but public spaces and green spaces are hard to find in America. It's not that they don't exist, it's that they're not always easily accessible because so much of American suburbia in particular is simply not built to be a walkable area of life. You have to have a car to get around in America. And even if you wanted to go to green spaces and parks, Utah has many of them, you have to drive there. Something I really, really value about our life in the UK is how much hypothetically green space is available to me. London, I believe, and I'll fact check myself on this and put a link somewhere either in the comments or around me, I think has the most green space per capita of any major metropolitan city on earth. And it makes a huge difference in quality of life. I've lived in London now for 15 years and I do not miss owning a car, not for 1 second. Someday Jeff and I might have a car, very much depending on where we end up living, when and if we're able to buy a home of our own. Um, let's be blunt, sometimes you need a car for family purposes or for if you don't live proximate to public transport. Again, something I'll come back to, I think, because that's its own section of this. But we haven't needed it. We haven't needed a car, and I have not missed the expense, the payments, the upkeep, the depreciating value of a massive asset that I have to look after or care about in 15 years. I don't miss having a car. From where I sit now, I live, just a couple of blocks away from this dog park, and there is a co-op grocery store like within 5 minutes of where I lived. And I've bragged about it before. My local kind of almost villagey high street has dozens of green grocers and butchers and increasingly a number of like small little independent cafes and stuff. Like I live within 5 minutes of almost anything that I need to buy for day-to-day life. It is walkable to me, it is accessible to me, and I don't need to own a car, i.e. take on that additional burden of care and expense in order to access them. And that's just not true for a lot of America. When we were in the States, staying at my angel in-laws house for the nearly 2 weeks we were there, we had to drive everywhere. Everywhere. Not only because it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit every single day that we were there, but quite literally, it was too far to walk to get to the local grocery store, especially for my mother-in-law who is, battling cancer. They live in a lovely neighborhood. They've lived there now for, I think, 40-something years. They love their local community. It's been very good to them. They're very, very plugged into their church community especially, which helps, provide that sense of community and care. But they can't leave their house really without using their car because you need the car to get literally everywhere. The grocery store, their church community, doctor's appointments, like absolutely everything requires a car to access. which again, when you kind of sit with the thought and flip it on its head a little bit, means that it's another thing you have to pay for in order to have a very, very, what I would consider basic quality of life experience. Let us not forget that there is a wholly unnecessary war on in the Middle East, yet again. Being an elder millennial is a real trip. And the price of gas is ferociously expensive, but we had to fill up the family car that we were using, I think 5 or 6 times while we were there. And again, we were there for just under 2 weeks. So just living life day to day, going to my sister-in-law's house for dinner, uh, going to the family wedding, or seeing friends very, very casually, cost a lot of money. It cost a lot of gas money to just leave the house every day, which, as I said, we needed to do. And circumstances being what they are right now, cost more than it used to cost just to fill up the tank. A walkable lifestyle and public transport truly are nothing to sneeze at. Don't get me wrong, I know that there's genuine issues and valid criticisms of some of the public transport access in the UK. For all of my British friends, I'm not dismissing that and I'm not minimizing it. But coming from a country that doesn't have a fraction of the equivalent, you notice a difference in the quality of life. It's profound. Not only that, because the US is as big as it is, it's not very well connected by things like train, for instance. So to get from one side of the country to the other, really your best option is to fly. Otherwise, it takes multiple days of train if you have it, or car or bus travel to get anywhere. It's an expensive country to get around. It's not very well connected. And I think that leads to that sense of regional divide and differentiation. It also creates a divide between cities and suburbia and rural life that is not just emotional or cultural, it's very, very practical. They are literally not well connected. And I think that has implications for things like our politics or what have you. Do not underestimate the value that comes from having a relatively well-connected country, even if it has its problems. It has immediate quality of life effects for the average citizen or resident, and I'd argue it has second and third order implications for the wider sense of community or cultural compatibility more broadly. I touched on this briefly, but I adore having access to public spaces. We lived for a decade in Bermondsey and Rotherhithe. Again, go check out the video I did with Misty to get a sense of what it was like to live so close to the Thames in that respect. But every single time, every single apartment we have lived in our entire time in London has been proximate to green space. When we first moved to Bermondsey, we literally lived adjacent to Southwark Park. Later, we moved a little bit closer to London Bridge Station, and we had a lovely, kind of open square just around the corner from our apartment, as well as lots of other parks along Bermondsey Street. When we lived on Rotherhithe, we didn't have a green park, but we lived on the Thames path. And so, quite literally, we lived on the river for a long time, and that gave us access to a lot of open space as well. I need to make a whole separate video about this at another point, but then when we lived in Lewisham and Blackheath, we literally lived on the edge of the heath, meaning the wide open green space of the heath and Greenwich Park was immediately available to us. And even now, I'm not going to go obviously into too much details, but we do live in the borough of Greenwich, which means that we have access to Greenwich Park, to Plumstead Common, to the Thames Path through Woolwich. We are just surrounded by green spaces, which helps keep things cooler than, say, New York City, which gives me a lot more ability to, just enjoy nature, which I think is really, really good for anyone's mental health, which allows me to be a responsible pet owner. And frankly, I think it's just good for the soul. I love trees, but this is very different from a lot of public park spaces in the United States. In suburbia in particular, public space and public parks tend to be a little bit more curated. They tend to be managed, usually by the local community, but in ways that feel a little bit more pristine. Think parks and recreation. We do have an abundance of public lands in the United States, currently under threat for various political reasons, but we have incredible public wealth in the form of public lands and national parks and monuments, which are fantastic, but again, are very, very difficult and literally expensive for most people to get to at some part. Like, it's very typical for Americans to go on a family vacation to a place maybe like Yosemite or the Grand Tetons or the Shenandoah Valley or what have you. But it normally requires effort and it normally requires money. Of course, that's similarly true in the UK. Some places that I've been to the Peaks, I've been to Snowdonia, I've been to the Lakes District. We've been hiking around the Isle of Skye in Scotland. Like, the UK is not starved for natural wealth and beauty by any stretch. But because the country is smaller, I'm not saying that the burden of travel is negligent, but I am saying that in my experience, it's significantly less than the burden of and cost of travel for most places in the US and for people to get to them. Don't take your public parks for granted, people. You have a wealth of public beauty here in the UK, and I'm so grateful to live in such close proximity to it. Jeff and I take advantage of it as much as we can for a couple who doesn't have a car. Obviously, property being on my mind, like something that I could not help but really be reminded of in just driving around suburbia in Utah is how, this is going to sound weird, go with me on this, but everything, we drove through so many neighborhoods in Utah that had an almost movie set quality to me. They felt too pristine. The houses looked too similar to one another. Property development in the States, particularly in suburbia, has meant that whole neighborhoods of basically cookie cutter identical houses are put up very quickly. And before you jump down my throat about, terraced row houses in the UK, yes, the concept is similar, but I'd argue that the execution is very different. We currently live in a Victorian row house. I love it, but I have never once wandered down the streets of our neighborhood, also made up of Victorian row houses, and felt that the area was lacking personality or character just because all of these houses happen to be constructed at the same time, in the same period of property development in this area of the city. And I do feel that way in a lot of the US. There's a kind of uncanny valley quality to several areas, particularly of more recent property development in suburbia America, that I just find a little bit unappealing. Again, the houses, one of my siblings-in-law and his family lives in a neighborhood that again felt like a movie set to me when I was driving around it. The houses were all bigger than they needed to be, like suspiciously like clean. And I keep saying this, go watch my video with Misty about this, because we touched on homeowners associations in that video, but they live in a community with the homeowners association, which I think has influenced the aesthetics of this community, which had an almost, again, plastic quality to them. You can tell that the houses are very, very new in terms of property development. Houses in the US tend to go up more quickly, but they also tend to be made of cheaper materials than building materials here in the UK. Plywood instead of bricks, for instance. That's, of course, a very, very broad blanket statement, but it's a broadly true one. And I couldn't put my finger on it, but the whole neighborhood to me felt almost fake. In a way that I do not mean to be an insult to anyone who lives there. I'm talking about the aesthetic quality. I'm obviously not going to share photos of my family's neighborhood residences, but maybe I'll find some stock imagery to put up on the screen so you can kind of see what I'm talking about when it comes to this sense of ultra processed, ultra same neighborhoods in America. I find that particularly the further west you go, because that tends to be newer than East Coast, which has literally more history to it, that the neighborhoods of suburbia in America just feel a little bit soulless. There's a lot of personality lacking in terms of the home design or home construction. The houses feel cheaper, they feel flimsier. It feels less permanent to me than a lot of neighborhoods that I've lived in the UK, which, to be fair, have existed for centuries. When Jeff and I talk about buying a home in the UK, we don't want a new build property. We don't want, a more current possibly more slapdash version of property, we would prefer to buy an older home, not least of all because it has character and personality and history to it. There's something really, really comforting and steady about knowing that that wall has stood there for a long time, and generally, the surveyors can confirm to you that it will stand for a couple more centuries before you need to worry about it. I just don't get the same kind of tactile experience with a lot of American property development. Um, and I'm just less interested in it. The other thing that really struck me was how big American houses are. Again, I don't say that to criticize any individual person or family member. Owning, a home that's, substantial enough to house and protect your family is quite literally part of the American dream. But it's fascinating to me how much space Americans seem to assume that they need versus how much space the average British person lives with, if that makes any sense. Again, I'm painting with a very wide brush here. I know that I am. Don't jump down my throat. But please do sound off in the comments about your personal lived experience. I'd love to hear about it. My broad observation is that British homes are smaller than American homes. And I think that's for a number of reasons. Number one, I think British culture has a greater sense of community. Again, see that other video that Misty and I did. There are third spaces like pubs and churches or church halls or village halls. There is places that you go to be with community. There is a culture of communal entertainment, particularly but not exclusively around pubs or greens or common land that I have not really seen an equivalent of in the U.S. The U.S., depending on the area, may very well have a lot of cool local traditions or festivals, like things like 4th of July parades, for instance, are so common, and there's normally some kind of like fete or festival associated with those kinds of holidays, which are, to be fair, a lot of fun. But it's not on par with or as prevalent as I find in British culture. Most Americans seem to want their home to be their everything. And on the one hand, I get it, but on the other hand, that's not the lifestyle that I want. An off-the-cuff comment that I made in the conversation with Misty about the importance of privacy, but that privacy is not the same as isolation, very much came out of my recent trip to the United States. Something that I ended up thinking a lot about and talking with Jeff a lot is like how isolating the American lived experience was. Again, if you're fortunate enough to have a community, whether that's through school or through a church or any other kind of neighborhood bonding, that's great. In fact, one of my sisters-in-law, her family is fantastically outdoorsy. They're involved with so many different projects and programs through school. They also seem to have a really, really lovely neighborhood community that engages in a lot of activities together, which I think is really nice. But again, so I'm not discounting individual experience. Again, I'm talking about a vibe, right? The vibe that I got in America was, again, an odd sense of isolation. Again, if I had to use my car every single time I wanted to leave my house, number one, it's expensive, and number two, it's just another thing to have to consider, and it adds another layer of effort or burden in getting outside your own curated space. Whether it's a homeowners association kind of dictating the aesthetics of your home and immediate neighborhood to you, or whether it's needing a vehicle to actually go out and engage meaningfully with your community, your hobbies, your friends, even your family. I just felt that there were more artificial barriers to community when I was in the States than when I am here. For example, I walk my dog every day. I know the local dry cleaner by name. He knows my dog by sight and always has treats ready for her. There is a lovely little independent coffee shop where I treat myself to coffee a couple times a week. And again, they know my dog by sight, and normally the cook has a tiny piece of ham to give to her because he is her boyfriend and she loves him more than me. My street, a couple times a year, participates in like a neighborhood jumble sale where almost all of the houses, just put their home goods that they're trying to get rid of out on the pavement, and either sell or swap home goods with one another. There is a local artist kind of community that once a year basically does like an open day sort of thing where local artists publish their contact details or open their studios, and you can just spend a weekend like going from house to house, looking at potentially buying local art. There is a farmers market that takes place once a month at the village hall just over there from where I'm sitting, and every single local pub has their karaoke night or their bingo night or their trivia night or their pride night or what have you. Like there's just so many possibilities for 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 low barrier community access and engagement here. And I am surprised at pleasantly at the sheer number of casual acquaintances that we've made in our 2 years living in this neighborhood and how easy it was to make them. Now, to be clear, this is once again very much influenced by my upbringing. I suspect that if I had lived in a community for an extended period of time, I'd feel very differently about this. But once again, I still think there's those additional barriers to community, like car access or local resources. Some communities are simply, wealthier and more evolved than others, and where you live can be the luck of the draw or the job market. Also, if you don't participate in some of the local structures, you might not have access to that community. So, for example, because Jeff and I are no longer, religious, Utah would be a hard place for us to live, because in spite of the fact that we have friends and family who live there, we need a car to access all of them. And also, a huge amount of the community building that happens in Utah happens off the back of pre-existing church community. And your mileage may vary at different, parts of the United States, different kinds of religious upbringings, but that sense of needing to be involved with another organization first, whether it's a church or a school or a club or something, while it can be a really good way to foster community, also might come with a more subtle barrier to entry, which might involve money or resources or tools, vehicles, what have you, that if you don't have, that community might not be as available to you. Does that make sense? Finally, and I probably need to do a whole video just on this at some point, let me know if you'd be interested, but I experienced a strange kind of low buzz of anxiety in my entire time in the States for reasons of health. The last time Jeff and I were in the States together, I ended up like scratching the cornea of my eye or something and getting an eye infection and having to go to the doctor unexpectedly. And healthcare being what it is in the States, my 10-minute meeting with a GP and subsequent prescription to keep a rather visually horrific situation under control cost us several hundred US dollars out of pocket. So on this trip, Jeff went on a hike with one of my brothers-in-law, and I was legitimately worried that he was going to break a leg or something while he was hiking, because we have to worry about things like that when we travel in a way that we simply don't have to worry about in our day-to-day existence here in the UK. The NHS is a flawed organization, but I will also defend it with my life. Again, maybe I need to do a whole separate video about that, but I believe very, very strongly in the right to access healthcare without it being an undue economic burden. So, like, even things for us like a holiday of going to the States, we always have to be mindful that, risk or accident is a very real thing, and the burden to us in the US is very different from our lived experience here in the UK. Again, I might have to do a whole video on my experiences with the NHS, because I've had a couple, and I have some nuanced takes on it. What it made me think of, though, besides, fretting that Jeff was going to literally tumble down a mountain at one point, was, again, how many day-to-day things are just harder or more expensive in the States. The good side of American culture is the story, at least, that if you work hard, you can earn your way to a better life. That is still somewhat true, and enough for the PR to not be totally false. But I also would argue that life in the US is more precarious. Even if you make a good income, there's numerous reported examples now, and I'll link some journalism or academic pieces on this below. But there's numerous examples of how many American individuals or families are basically one lost paycheck or one unexpected expense or one medical emergency away from poverty or precarity. And that's something that I simply don't get here in the UK. There's a better social safety net here. There are workers' protections here. There is healthcare here that isn't tied to your employment, i.e., you don't have to prove your value to society in order to be allowed the right to live. Again, I need to do a whole video on the NHS at some point, I think. I feel more insulated against risk or shock living in the UK than I do in the US because the culture of the US is so very much, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Your success or failure is your own fault, whether or not that it's true, and it's mostly not. For all of the genuinely really good things and the consumer options and choice that is available to the average American, there is a low sense of precarity or risk that I feel culturally whenever I'm there that doesn't exist in the UK in the same way. I cannot stress enough that I'm not discounting individual lived experience. I'm not discounting wide demographic trends. I'm not discounting the real realities of poverty or loss or harm. I'm not. But I am saying that there is a quiet, unspoken desperation in American suburbia that I have felt or experienced of just knowing how fragile it all is. How one car accident, could remove your access to a vehicle, which for all of the reasons I've discussed might mean that you can't get groceries or go to work as easily as you could. And the solutions available to you are less in the case of public transport, or might be dependent on community that might itself have other barriers of access to you. Access to public goods, whether it's, parks or whether it's healthcare, have more layers and boundaries between them in the US than I feel that I have in the UK. Even very, very small things like personality when it comes to neighborhoods or homes, I feel that's more within the control of the average British neighborhood than what I have seen in the US. There's less of a sameness in Britain, which is an odd thing to say because Britain, you know that I love you, but you have your quirks too. But I notice that America feels more cookie cutter in its sameness. You can tell that the entire neighborhood bought the exact same home decor or, garden or lawn kind of decor from the exact same local superstore. And everyone kind of looks a little bit the same as a result. None of this is particularly scientific. I'm not purporting for it to be, except in cases, again, where I can cite some very, very specific stats, facts, and figures. I'm mostly talking about my feelings, the sense I got of the vibe when I was there. Every time I go back to America, I am reminded that in so many important ways, at the core of myself, I am still American. But I'm also reminded time and time again that I haven't lived there in 15 years. And I wasn't raised there growing up. And that for all there are certain aspects of my values and my personality and my perspective that are intrinsically tied to my nation state of birth, I don't exist in that place comfortably or easily. And I don't really want to. I very much appreciate and value the life that my partner and I have been able to build in another country that in many ways is foreign to my raised experience, but has given me the opportunities to structure a life that's more in keeping with the values that I personally espouse, the kind of priorities that I want sociopolitically in my community, and allowed me, in some ways, a different kind of luxury of choice than even ultra-consumerist America ever gave me. I don't know. This has been a bit of a ramble. As always, my dog parks videos are not terribly well structured, but I'm always glad to go home. I'm always glad to see my people. I'm always glad to spend the time and energy and money to reinforce those relationships, because relationships to me truly are the most important aspect of life. I'm so, so glad that we were able to get quality time with Jeff's family, because I know that he he misses them and treasures them very dearly. And getting that time is so important to him. I'm also so grateful that we got to see friends. I am going to try and splice together some of the footage I took of my favorite places to eat in Salt Lake City, so that if you ever find yourself on that side of the Intermountain West, I have recommendations for you. My July of travels reminded me in a lot of ways of how much I love the UK, how grateful I am to live here, and kind of reaffirmed that, my stroke our desire to build a permanent life here is the right one for us. I don't want a big house. I want a house that feels like me and my partner. I don't want to rely on things like a vehicle in order to access my daily goods. I don't want to feel like I have to go through additional steps in building a community. I want to be able to put in the good faith effort and hopefully be met by other people doing the same without having to spend um, additional money or joining additional clubs or what have you. I I want to be able to host friends and family whenever I can. That's something that I value so much. But I also want to be able to, have a local pub where I have neighbors who I recognize and who I don't have to know them as best friends to value them as community acquaintances. I want to be on a first name basis with my barista and dry cleaner. And that's the life that I have here in Britain. Um, and I treasure it and I value it. So, as grateful as I am to go back to the States, as important as it is for me to, reaffirm those connections, and as American as I fundamentally am in some ways, it's good to be home. Let me know if anything I said here resonates. Let me know if you disagree. But particularly if you don't live in my neck of the British woods, so to speak, please tell me about some of your lived experiences. I've gotten so many lovely comments from you guys, particularly telling me about your local villages or towns or some of the local clubs or community things you get up to. I love that shit. Please keep it coming. I enjoy it so tremendously. But if there's anything else that you are interested in knowing about either my personal lived experience growing up because it was non-standard, or possibly more questions about my recent visit to the United States, please let me know. Also, again, go check out my recent chat with Misty. I love hanging out with her, and we talk a lot about things like the process of home ownership and uh, our mutual kind of experiences of community building. So that chat is absolutely worth your time. Don't worry, we're also doing more of those. So if there's anything you want to hear me talk about, or if you want anything you want me to talk about with Misty, drop a comment below. Tizzy has collapsed in the dust over here, so I think that's my signal that it's time to wrap this up and head home. Thanks for hanging out with me at the dog park, kittens. I'm glad to be back in the sort of green and pleasant land. Chat soon.